wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful
Guyana will become the next Dubai, and we, the citizens of Guyana, are super excited to benefit from our homeland the same way the citizens of Dubai benefit from theirs.
This is what life is like for citizens from the Emirate of
Guyana will become the next Dubai.
with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful Guyana.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Globespan 360. This evening, we are going to be discussing or continuing our discussion on ethnic relations, but we want to pause a broad-based discussion and look very clearly at historically how land has been distributed or not distributed in Guyana. With me, I have Ravi Dev, Vitaram Ramharak, and Vincent. I'm forgetting. Sorry? Now, this is a strange one. This is a senior moment.
Vincent Alexander.
Vincent Alexander. So if anybody had told me I would have done that, I would have said no, but it happened. I do apologize, Vincent.
Happens all the time.
I understand.
To
It
me?
happens to me.
And I just want to say that I think I speak for all of us here on this panel, and perhaps, and certainly hope for other Guyanese, when I say that in our discussions here, we have been learning a lot from each other. We have also, I think, learned to be open to listen to what's coming back to us and beginning to see ourselves and our country and our people, or peoples, it depends upon how you want to do that, as in ways that are different and more meaningful and rewarding than when we started this journey. So I'm going to make a statement about land and hope that we could deepen our discussion. I want to observe, though, that it's when we look at a specific issue historically, how it has developed, and compare the experiences of different groups of Guyanese, then we begin to see differences that are meaningful. And it's important to make the point that advantages or disadvantages are not necessarily the fault of any one group who either enjoys an advantage or is kept back by a disadvantage. It's part of our historical condition, our inheritance. And in our attempt to understand ourselves, if we don't do this kind of methodology, where we look at issues, specific issues over time, and compare the experiences of each other, we're not going to make sense of where we are. We're not going to appreciate how some people thrived, how others didn't, and why. And we open ourselves to a continuation of some of the tainted expectations and explanations we traditionally have made about each other. The next thing I want to say is that we have been imposed upon, all of us who were brought or came to Guyana, by a system that valued or placed the highest value on one race, that's the Europeans, and that the extent to which you were different from Europeans, and beginning with the European male, is the extent to which you were, let's say, cursed by that system. There are other aspects of it, like African people being faced with the greatest challenges, and by that I mean erasure and distortion of identity, history, and culture. And I think these are important considerations to take on hand, on board, when we begin our analysis. So that's my framing of what I hope we will do. And I just want to make a general statement on land in Guyana and say that African people have been denied land or denied access to land to an extent that is unmatched by other groups of Guyanese. So I want to begin by talking about the period of enslavement when African people humanized the Guyanese environment by hand, but for the benefit of our enslavers. And when African people helped to force the physical end of certain aspects of enslavement, and I think people adventurously call that emancipation, but we weren't emancipated. We had to buy exhausted land at inflated prices. We have become accustomed to celebrate the village movement. But there are two reasons why we should be a bit more reflective on that. And one is what I just said. We spent most of our funds on buying exhausted land. So it's a good thing to buy land, but we didn't have any more money to fund our development. And the banks and so on, the system was hostile to us. We weren't loaned that money. So that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is that it wasn't just a village movement. It was a movement a civilizational movement, much wider than a village movement. How does land fit into all of that? Well, land is the physical basis of community and development. And African people were prevented from owning land by the regulations that were changed to make certain that African people couldn't combine to buy lands in meaningful quantities that could sustain an independent existence. And as the country unfolded, there were several instances when African Guyanese made demands for land. For example, immediately after the 1905 rebellion, and they were persistently denied that land. I mentioned Indian land settlement. Now, it's no fault of the Indians that they had an advantage there, and land was made available relatively easily to some Indian people, at least. Now, African people didn't have that experience. How about the Portuguese? You're going to see Portuguese were given access to land in ways that the other two groups didn't have. So many Portuguese ended up on grants and wood cutting and so on. So I just wanted to kick the ball off with that kind of a framework and note that if we don't look at land, if we don't look at financing, if we don't look at things, like education or identity or history throughout the history of Guyana as a thing in itself, we would not be making any much more progress in our attempts to understand our experiences and therefore explain not only where we are, but where we need to go and how we need to get there as a country. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope that Ravi will have some things to tell us on this score.
Well, I do appreciate your introductory remarks there, Kimani. I think it's very important that all our discussions be placed within contexts, because context is everything. I mean, it determines something in one context is totally different in another context. And I think it's something that's not really appreciated in Guyana, and I'm happy that you have emphasized it. So within that whole notion of putting into context, I'd like us to start rather than with the European enslaving African people and their restrictions on African people not to have land. I want to go before that all of these lands were occupied by people. Before the Europeans came, Columbus thought he had hit India, ironically, and called them Indians, and later they were called American Indians. And I prefer what we are been recently talking about, which is that they're the indigenous people. They were here before. And I think that's an important point that we have to make, because there's some confusion about the land, coming to historic land distribution, about the land that is being distributed to them. It is important to note that for those peoples, unlike many other places, after some episodic attempts to enslave some of these indigenous peoples, the Dutch who settled our present-day Guyana, the Dutch really worked out treaties with these indigenous people, and there were structured interactions where the Dutch accepted the rights of these indigenous people to their lands implicitly by bringing them gifts, making treaties with them, having agreements with them. And we will come later to the whole notion, and we should discuss it, as to how they use the indigenous people to hunt down African enslaved people who try to escape from their predicament. And it's an important development that we mustn't shy away from discussing. It is part of our history, and it ought to be discussed. So coming back to my introduction on this historic land distribution, that the Dutch had a kind of, I wouldn't say equal, it was never equal, but they had this relationship with the indigenous people, where they accepted that these indigenous people had rights. So when the British took over our 3 colonies, and they accepted explicitly to bring over, to accede to all of the laws that the Dutch had formulated, and one of those was this whole notion of having treaties and agreements with the Amerindians, and one of those agreements was having to do with land. So when Mr. Burnham and the PNC went up to London to discuss our so-called independence, which, just like emancipation, I put in scare quotes, but he went up there into this manufactured so-called independence. He took up the representative of the Amerindians, and he was able to put on the table their claim to land. And that is how, as Annex C to our independence document, it describes that the lands that are occupied by Amerindians, there's this term of art called from time immemorial, which is not as harsh as it sounds. They have to have occupied it, and they have rights to that land. And the PNC did start, I think, around 69 or 76 to begin that process, and it has been continued since, and it's still an ongoing process. So I want to start with that in our historic land distribution, to our credit, the indigenous people's right to the land that they occupied in full. We can't quibble about with our present borders that they weren't here or there. They were here overall, and we have set now these artificial boundaries that Venezuela might make contest. So I want to start with that, and I think we can then go forward further.
Veteran?
Well, good evening, everyone. What I like to do is I'm always thinking when we have these discussions, how do we talk about context, but how do we make it relevant to the context of today in the situation in which we're living? Obviously, we know we're dealing with a historical question of land and land distribution. It is an important topic. I believe it was 2017, Granger had actually appointed a land commission. There were presentations made to that commission, and I believe a report was submitted in 2018. Maybe Vincent can correct me on that. But I do believe also that when that commission was announced, you had opposition from 2 sides. One, you had an opposition from the Amerindian community saying that, well, this commission is lumping the Amerindian, struggle with that of African. The PPP, I I believe through Anil Nanal in Parliament and so on, had opposed this commission. I think one of the argument was that it is probably going to be divisive. I don't know if that's the word that was used. But the point I'm trying to make here is that it was an issue that was seen as if it was contentious, and I think it was. So that commission, I believe, did its work, and a report was submitted in 2018. Nothing was mentioned about the Indian concern when it comes to land distribution. So I do want to make that point. So to come back to what I premise my statement on, which is that it has to be seen in the context in which we're living. Obviously, we are a plural, ethnically plural society, and of course, when it comes to land distribution is important. I mean, there's a famous statement that says land is equal to money, and the question is, how do you accumulate that land? Or historically, were there impediments? So putting that in context and trying to relate this topic to where we are today, I do have three questions, and this might sound as if I'm a little mannish, to use a Guyanese language, but there are three questions I would like to pose. They do have a historical connection. So my first question is this, and I think this would be a question that people who might be watching this show today may have on their minds. The first one is, and I'm also curious about this, given how contentious this issue has been. Whether you're looking at the report from that commission, or whether you're listening to Eric Phillips when he talks about, the historical claims that, let's say, ACTA would make on land acquisition. So my first question, and again, this is all based on curiosity, and maybe the folks on this panel can help me understand. So I'm trying to be a student here. Was there any land historically that was taken away from Africans and given to Indians? Right, that's my first question. And I'm curious about that because if you're accusing, in a divided society, one community of having access to land, I don't hear the argument being made that the land was given to Indians. I do hear the argument being made that acquisition of land by Indians was much easier. I don't know what that means. I mean, in neighboring Suriname, you could make that argument, where, for instance, Indians were given land by the state, right? They were given 100 guilders, and they were given rent-free land for 6 years, right? We never had that kind of situation in Guyana. Well, we can talk more about that. So that's my first question. My second question is this. Obviously, history will impact what we do today. So my question is, if the land that was taken away from Africans, if that's the argument, and people have been living on that land over the years, and they have developed that land, whether it's Africans or Indians, how do we deal with that situation today, right? How do we rectify that problem? And my third question, and this is where I'm going to, put on my hat as if I'm sitting in a rum shop. The third question is this. Is this an argument being made by Africans that they have an entitlement to land acquisition? When you listen to people like Nigel Hughes in May, he made the argument that, well, there's evidence for this in terms of, what Africans are being owed. He points to the Venn Commission of 1949 as a sort of evidence that, hey, history owes Africans some kind of reparations to this whole notion, dealing with this whole notion of land. So again, is this about entitlement? And I think that's a legitimate question, because we have had people make arguments on that the state has to rectify this problem. And if we are saying that the state has to rectify this problem. I'm curious, is this the current state that we're living in Guyana, meaning the government of Guyana, or is this referring to the historical plantocracy that governed Guyana? Who's going to make that reparation, right? So are we asking the current state to be part of that process? And if we're doing that, I guess an offshoot to that question is, what about the other people who live in this plural society? So I will leave it at that.
Vincent? You're muted, Vincent.
Vincent,
You're muted.
muted.
Sorry, good evening to all.
Good
Firstly,
evening.
let me say, first of all, that my contribution is premised on the objectives of the decade as declared by the United Nations for the people of African descent. And it's not intended to be prejudicial to any other. And that premise speaks about really how we use institutional mechanisms and legal framework to readdress the issues of recognition, justice, and development for the people of African descent, on the premise that, in fact, there has been lack of recognition, injustices, and under, if not lack, of development of the people. In that context, I want to contribute to this conversation. And I want to say from the inception that the question of land is a very critical question, because land is associated not only with people's material being and their material development, but I would contend that land is also associated with people's spiritual being and spiritual development. And so the land really is that element which reflects the totality of human, in a sense, history and human aspiration. And therefore, against that background, one has to look to see what has happened in terms of the historical occupation, historical development, historical distribution of land, and the kind of impact it may have had on the people's development, on their very spiritual and psychological being. And one really can look across the globe and see the way in which this argument can hold water. And to apply that to the state of the people of African descent in relation to land based on what has historically happened with them. Suffice to say that there is also the contention that even prior to the coming of the indigenous people, because it is argued that they also came, that there is some evidence that there was an African presence prior to their coming. I don't think we've been able to explore and explain, break between that presence and coming of the indigenous people and subsequently what occurred. But there is a contention that there was an African presence. And more it's been argued that particularly in the Berbice area, given the kind of soil that is found there, that in fact it represented the transfer of soil from Africa to this part of the world, and is one of the bases for the contention that people of African descent were here even before the indigenous people, so to speak, got here. And one should bear in mind that Dennis Williams, in some of his archaeological work, did start to unearth the kind of artifacts, etc., that would suggest that presence of the people of African descent. But having said that, I would hasten to say that we should not make that the bone of contention, and that discussion that focuses on the coming of the peoples, starting with the Amerindians and going on, in our circumstance, our present-day circumstance, would suffice. But even in that context, there's also the contention that not all of the Amerindian tribes, coming of the Amerindian tribes, predated the arrival of the enslaved people, and that there were at least 3 tribes that came after. And that is an important point to note, because there's been no disaggregation and differentiation across those tribes in relation to the way in which we've settled, in principle, the question of Amerindian lands. And that those who may have come even after the enslaved people, and I dare say the Europeans came, are treated in the manner which those who are the first people are in fact treated. And so that's an interesting point, I think, that ought to be noted as well in this context. Now, what I want to go on to say is that the people of African descent, the enslaved people, would not have had the same spiritual and material relationship with land, given the manner in which they came, the purpose of which they came, and the relationship that they were involved in that did not exclude how land was treated. So that there's some spiritual and psychological issues in relation to the people of African descent and land from the very inception, which are quite different to a very large extent to others who came. And that having come into that circumstance, one could see that the people of African descent, after the abolition of slavery, sought to reconnect with their own history and their own being by virtue of what they sought to do in terms of acquiring of lands. And that purchase of lands was in a sense going back to a relationship that had been broken by virtue of enslavement, but going back to that relationship in a place called Guyana, and probably trying to rebuild that spiritual and material relationship, which is at the foundation of any people, the foundation of any nation. But to see that in their attempt to do that, again, they encountered difficulties, and they did not have the possibility of that renaissance, so to speak, because of the manner in which the land they sought to occupy, the land which they bought, was treated. In some regards, they were dispossessed, not physically, but dispossessed in the sense that, having been flooded out and things like that, they could not establish and did not necessarily establish that foundational relationship that a nation would have with its land. And therefore, in some regards, continue to be aliens in relation to the land, and their association with Guyana became much more an association in terms of the stability of being involved in the public sector, the adventures into the mining, which in itself also has some land elements and probably represented a greater renaissance of a people's relationship with land. And so the whole psyche of the African Guyanese people would be different to the psyche of others in relation to land. But that psyche does not necessarily mean that they don't have an entitlement, because the very being of people is associated with an entitlement of land. The very development of people is associated with entitlement of land. And they, notwithstanding the relationship that they had with the land during slavery, did work, develop the land. And therefore, that also represents a manner in which they could look back and lay claim to land, having been the ones who were largely involved in the civilization of the coast during the period of slavery. And they can also look back and lay claim based on the what our ancestors did in terms of trying to rekindle the relationship with land by virtue of what we now refer to as the village movement. And so that's also context in which we have to look to the question of land and the people of African descent. And in that regard, we also have to look at the manner in which not only were they dispossessed by virtue of what happened to the village lands and things like that, they may have been physically there, but to a large extent dispossessed because of accessibility, capacity to really relate to the land. We also have to look at the institutional and legal framework, which were subsequently developed and which in many regards are still extant today, that have sought to distance them from the possession of lands which they, in fact, should have inherited by virtue of the purchase of those lands by their ancestors. And so we have, in a sense, two categories of land that we speak into. We speak into lands that they played a major role in making habitable, and we speak in the lands which they subsequently purchased and are in the context of the capitalist system, the owners and inheritors of. And so as I continue the discussion, it has to be from those two perspectives. It's from those two perspectives that one speaks to the Eric Phillips contention about how much land should really be quitted to the people of African descent, and equally the question of what is referred to as ancestral lands in terms of those lands acquired through the village movement.
Thanks, Vincent. I guess it's my turn now again. And I just want to address a few of the things that people said, that jumped out at me. The first thing I want to do is thank Ravi for correcting me. I started in the wrong place. Indigenous people were here before everybody else, insofar as we've been able to establish. Vincent has raised the tantalizing question of an African presence before the indigenous presence. And while there has been a few pieces of evidence to that, I don't think we know enough or near to enough to make any robust claims about an African presence in Guyana in particular in a way that would be meaningful. It doesn't mean it wasn't there, but we just don't know enough. And I think that it's important for us to be able to say that. So Ravi, thanks for bringing us back to the beginning, because that's very important. European ways of thinking often exclude indigenous people. And there's a reason for that, because Europeans met these people here. they own the land. And Europeans violently dispossessed Amerindians, as we call them today, of their land. And many European nations introduced an obscene notion of terra nullius, which means empty land, to say that nobody was living there. How could people not own the land in their own country? And it's this kind of ridiculous racist nonsense that is important for us to be able to refute in some of our history books. And that's why it's important for us to have a different history and a different understanding of ourselves. We just can't continue to rely upon a European definition of our reality and expect that we'll be able to liberate ourselves from European colonialism. So thanks for that. And, I think pointing out how the Dutch made treaties with indigenous nations that were aimed at keeping African people enslaved is divide and rule. And all of us in Guyana today should learn the necessary lessons from that. If we share interests with anybody else and we allow a third person to divide us and therefore go against our interests, then we're not doing ourselves any favor. And this is one of the ways in which we could contemplate our historical experience in Guyana, learn the necessary lessons, and emerge as better people. So I would recommend that we talk about that at some stage, think about it, and make certain that we learn the necessary lessons. And again, Ravi, I think you've established that that Forbes Burnham perhaps put indigenous access to land in the Constitution. Why it happened, how it happened, those are questions we could delve deeper in. But here is one group of people whose access to their own land has been constitutionally guaranteed. And I think that's a good model to talk about. Betoram, I congratulate you for asking those questions because they provide a platform, as you say, for useful discussion. Now, there's a concept of African ancestral land that many people don't understand, and we've been using it. It might surprise you to know that this centers around the burial, the ritual burial of navel string, placenta, and dead bodies, which make land ancestral land. I don't want to go too much into it, but I have traced that complex, ancestral land complex to before ancient Egypt. And it's certainly very explicit in ancient Egypt. If you ever have 3 or 4 hours, I could go into details about it. It's part of my current research and I've written up on it. But we could go back over 7,000 years of that being inscribed in African, maybe DNA. And that's why African people in Guyana would say, "My neighbor string buried there," and that kind of thing. So despite the fact that African people's culture was suppressed, oppressed, erased in part and so on, there's still aspects of it that are being practiced, and some people are still researching to reconnect to that culture. So part of the answer to your question, Betoram, has got to be all of us, but especially African people, understanding who they are by understanding their culture. And there are instances in which immediately after the legal termination of physical aspects of enslavement in Guyana, African people acted exactly as they would have acted X thousands of years ago because of the same cultural understandings, ramifications, pullings, whatever we might call them, so that people moved from far away and went back to live on their ancestral lands. So, that's there, that's part of our explanation. And it's important to ask the question you asked. Okay, These African people had ancestral lands, blah, blah, blah. What happened with the Indians? What happened with the Portuguese? What has been their experiences? We must keep asking that. That's the only way in which we're going to begin to see that there are qualitatively different experiences of people. And that is part of what will help to explain our current conditions. And Vincent's notion of the spiritual and psychological attachment to the land and the ramifications in those ways is taken care of on the African ancestral land. It's a whole explanation that needs to be done. And like I said, some of us have done and are doing that research. Now, Bitaram's question about whether there was any land taken away from African Guyanese and given to Indians, the answer to that, as far as I know, is both no and yes. No in the sense that I don't know any state that did that. Yes, in the sense that I know that many Indian people are squatting on African Guyanese land. And because of many African Guyanese are reticent to engage the system, they, Indian people, some Indian people are getting through, if you might say, with squatting on African Guyanese land. Now, I don't know the extent to which that is so. I don't know if African Guyanese or some African Guyanese are squatting on Indian land and blah, blah, blah. But I've often heard this, and I know that that has happened to me, that Indian people are right now squatting on some prime land that I own. So, you have that kind of messy situation that asking this question has got to, focus upon that, and we've got to clear it up. It's part of our duty. Now, if land was taken away from Africans, and I would say and other people who are living on that land, how do we deal with that? Let's say that your hypothetical question is, yes, there's this big area, call it 2 square miles, you discover somewhere that belong to African people. And Indian people or any other Guyanese, could be another set of Africans, who are living on that land. They built their houses and that kind of thing. How do you deal with that situation? We've got to be honest enough and informed enough to deal with that situation. We have to take everybody's interest into account. Now, I don't know what would be the answer to that. But what I do know is that we just cannot shove a situation like that under the blanket, don't address it, because we're building up resentments, and it's precisely because we want to get rid of those resentments, minimize misunderstanding and conflict, that we have to bring all of that kind of thing into the open and discuss it openly, honestly with each other. That's how we're going to find solutions. There are experts who would come up with solutions that might enlighten us. But the one I enjoy is you asking about the state. Which state is responsible for making things right, assuming that African Guyanese have a claim on land? But let me say this, there are two things there. One is that any state inherits both the liabilities and the assets of the previous state. So it doesn't matter which state you're talking about in Guyana. Once there's a genuine claim that arose, doesn't matter when in the past, the current state has a right and a duty to address that. And this is not only a legal question, it's a moral, political, economic, and so on question. Because if people have a genuine grievance and any state does not address it, then that grievance will continue. And you're looking at social discordance because you have people with a grievance. The other thing I want to focus on here is the question of reparations. And I don't think that many Guyanese appear to understand what reparations really is. Now, let me preface my statement by saying that even the United Nations, and I say even, because the United Nations are not there for African people, even the United Nations has recognize that Africans all over the world have been so decimated that the reparations are in order. So that means that we need to understand what happened to African people and how what happened to African people still continues to affect African people qualitatively. I started to make an allusion to people running a race in one of the previous discussions we had. And if we imagine that somebody was held back for a minute and then told, okay, you could run now, and then the person was tripped up some while after, and then something else happened, 3, 4, 5 things happened. Can you really say that that person is a lazy person? They don't have talent because all the other fellows, or most of them, got through the tape before that person. Now, it's a crude analogy, but when we begin to see historically the kind of obstacles that were placed in the way of African Guyanese people, and you begin to understand that other people did not have some of these challenges or the magnitude of those challenges for the length of time that they've had them, that's when you begin to understand that we're not talking about an experience that is, shall we say, equitable. It's more than equality we're dealing with. So the question of reparations is one that's very much alive today. There's a British all-party conference in the House of Commons that they've asked me to address on Saturday on the question of reparations. There have been many things, United Nations have held things and so on. So I think it's important that we inform ourselves about why reparations, what it means and that kind of thing. And that's one of the places I would start with and say, yes, the current state, doesn't matter which state it is, must make reparations. And let me just say that all neocolonial aspects of the state, and this includes the PNC state, should have made reparations to African Guyanese. But I would hope that we talk about reparations in a way that's calculated to inform the Guyanese public about what reparations really are. Not just a question of going and give African Guyanese or any other Guyanese for that matter, some money or whatever it is and say, take this reparations. All Guyanese need to know what's happening with their money or resources and why it's being used. And again, we come to the question of education. Many of us just don't know enough about our history and about current questions in the air. So the only other thing I would say here is that one of the things to understand is the way in which, Vincent mentioned this, African people were persistently dispossessed of land. Even those village lands bought at inflated prices, they were flooded out. People were taxed out of existence. And part of the reason why African Guyanese left the coastal villages in significant numbers and went into the gold and diamond mining industry in the interior and into the bauxite zone was because life in their coastal villages was not as attractive. They were pushed off of that land in these ways. So I just want to stop it there and go to Ravi.
Where do I begin? Let me start
where you began with me at the beginning.
Well, I'll pick up with something close to that, with what Vincent says in terms of the African spiritual connection with land, which I think is a very, very important observation. In fact, very early on, there's a group that I'm associated with out of India that looks at pre-European civilizations. And we came out with a booklet called African Indian Ethos. And it has a lot to do with how these two civilizations saw land and to be integrally associated with the land and Mother Nature and all of that, what it means. So, for example, as a Hindu, 86% of the Indians who were brought from Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, are of Hindu background, and and this is something that needs to be taught in Guyana, that why Indians have this thing about land. I see in all the history books, they call it hunger. These people are like, and in fact, some people interpret it as a greed for land. But the point is that out in the Gangetic Plains, they evolved a philosophy of the earth as mother. Dharti Mata, Mata means mother, Dharti means earth, the earth mother. So that is something even to today, we are worshiping, we're in a period of Navrat, where we are worshiping God. It's our symbolism in a female forms, 9 forms for the 9 days. And one of them would be Dharti Mata, that this earth is what gives us it all. And you start from there. You start from there. The sun would give you energy, but it's the earth that has to take that energy and blossom to give us all that we need. In fact, the particular form of the mother that is being worshipped tonight is called Kushananda, which is the sun, the energy that gives this energy. So to come back to this whole, it's an important point that if we're going to weave a national narrative, let's take this whole notion of land, that not only the African people, but also Indians, especially the Hindus, and also the Amerindians, the indigenous people, they have that very, very deep spiritual connection with the land. So when we use terms rather easily, that we civilize the coast, and we are using European notions of what civilization meant. So here you had these indigenous peoples who were living as one with Mother Nature, with Dharti Mata. And yet we are saying now to destroy it, to strip it, like we are doing with the Amazon today. That is said to be civilizational, and we are proud of it, to destroy, not to coexist. And it's going to come back in the ass and bite us. And it is global warming and all of that. So I want to put that, when we talk about these issues, let us at least concede that we can't have it both ways. In one sense, we can't hark back to our civilizational ethos in each of the major peoples in Guyana that see the earth as mother, to see Mother Nature as one. When the Christians mocked Africans and Indians for worshipping trees and praying to trees and, animism, and we're pagans and animists and all of that. At the same time, we can then talk of treating Mother Nature like dirt and having dominion over it, as the West has insisted we do, and say it's civilizational. We can't. We got to, put a stop to it. For example, as a Hindu, every morning when a Hindu wakes up, they are supposed to. There's one set of prayer that we connect the universe, right? And then we connect it with Mother Earth, the second set of prayer. And we say that, "Oh, Mother Earth, forgive me for stepping on you." Every single morning before we step out of bed, we ask her forgiveness, or Shama, for stepping on her. That is much, it starts Vishnu Pati Namo Stubhyam. I don't want to go on with all of that, but it's Sanskrit, and it's very, very ancient. It goes back 5,000-6,000 years in Rig Veda. So I want to start there. And I'll never forget once I was arrested during Mr. Hoyt's regime in '89 for protesting the 10-to-1 devaluation back in '89. And I was thrown into the jail at Leonora there, and Mr. Koyana and Moses Bagwan came. I always say I was associated more with the WP than anybody else. And, we got bail and what have you. And I said, if you could go to Georgetown, and then Moses called, we were going. And as we passed Denamstil, of course, is a preparatory village that was bought a cotton, a coffee plantation was bought by the freed and enslaved people. And Mr. Guyana pointed out to me the whole ambiance of Den Amstel as opposed to the other village. And while some people may say, man, it's all full of bush, Mr. Guyana pointed out to me that the African people, those who are in touch with their original ethos, are much more comfortable with Mother Nature and don't insist on civilizing it. And it's something that I think we need to observe, because it goes back to what I have said in other programs, that the 13,355 so-called liberated Africans who were brought post-emancipation between 1838 and 1874, they brought, it was not, their culture was not ground out of them, and much that they brought survives. So, for example, we have to ask the question, if those people from West Africa who were brought knew of rice culture, and the question has to be asked, because we have that famous anecdote of some soldiers stumbling over a village of Maroons, and we did have Maroons, and we have to talk about those at some point. What is their right to land and what have you? But they had enough rice to feed 700 people for a year. So why didn't the freed Africans who bought villages, why didn't they plant rice? It's a question. It's not that they didn't have the technology. It was there, it had been planted. And these are questions that we have to ask. So coming back to, I want to put that in perspective, that no one group to me in Guyana has any prior legitimacy to land ownership because of that spiritual connection. And in fact, I have always argued in my own village of Iflat that in 1841, because I'm doing a history of my village, and in 1841, the Scottish Presbyterian Church established St. Luke's as a parish and established a church at by the public road there. So when the Africans came out of the nigger yard, excuse the term, but that's how it was said, as Mark Carter called it, when they came out, and of course Indians moved into, in fact, Donald Ramutar's parents came out of the nigger yard. I found that out and told him that. I'm tracing different people's roots. They came out into St. Luke's parish. And this is something that African people need to deal with, that we can't have it both ways. We came out of slavery, enslavement under white people, and we went into a church, a Christian church, that was again run by white people. And we expect them to teach us to be liberated. It's a contradiction in terms. It's a contradiction in terms. What did they teach us? When I say us, I mean, African Guyanese who were there. It's from Iflat, so I can say us. I'm an Iflat man. What did they teach us? Oh, you must accept your lot and go back and plant, and never mind the planters took away your provision ground. Where my father got a house lot in 1950, if you look at the map that Rodney has in his book, it's called provision grounds. Those were the provision grounds that the enslaved people could use. But yet, by the time they moved out there, those were taken away. And they had to, what did they do? So in Iflat, we don't have any villagers planting anything. There was no land. They were just like in Antigua, where there was no land. All of them had to end up working the plantation. So this is something we must talk about. So coming back to ancestral land, the question that Beto posed, and here again, we can have it both ways. If we're going to use legalism to talk about the modern state that we inherited in 1966, taking on the rights and responsibilities of the prior state, then we are accepting Western legalism, and we can't pick and choose. We can't cherry pick. So coming back to the whole notion of land and land ownership, the West and the UN has a specific, it's a term of art as to what is ancestral land, right? And the dispute, Betoram, for the Commission of Inquiry was about whether you can now, African Guyanese can take on this term ancestral land when the UN defines it as land that were held by time immemorial by these indigenous people. My friend Ronald Waddle, made the argument back in the day when we used to be on Channel 9 about African people in not having any knowledge of where they came from. In a sense, had made that what some scholars call it was an abyssal movement across the Atlantic. It was so that all memory was wiped out. But here again, we can't say that they retained culture and yet it's abyssal. There's all these contradictions we have to work out. So I come back to that the whole notion of ancestral land was disputed during that Commission of Inquiry. And this is something that we need as a people, all of us, to sit around a table and come to some agreement that our narrative, we can be on all fours going forward. There'll be points of disagreement, not everything. I'm not a liberal in the sense of that institutions can somehow deliver utopia. There'll always be disagreements, but the point is that it must be not antagonistic, but agonistic, to use Arendt's term, agonistic, which is that we know there is tension, we know there's disagreement, but we are all fighting for this common goal. So I want to close on that note that there is a spiritual connection by all our peoples in Guyana to the land, and it's something we should I hate to use the term resurrect as a Hindu. We don't have resurrection, but become a term in the language that we have to bring it back and to let us deconstruct this whole notion of what is ancestral land and have some kind of agreement going forward. And I think it's a very important discussion in Guyana that must not be swept under the carpet, or in my case, in my house, we didn't have carpet, we had rice bag. Kimani?
Well, there's a couple of things, but I do want to share a story. Many years ago, I was a student at City College in Harlem, and we had a club. So we used to invite speakers to come over and give presentations. So we formed an Indian club. This was the natural thing to do because we didn't feel comfortable in the Caribbean club or the club that was made up of Indians from India. So we invited this scholar from Trinidad and to give a presentation on the history of Indians. So he came, we invited a college community, they all came out. And so this guy began to speak for an hour. He looked at the audience. It was mostly people of Indian descent from the Caribbean, but there were about 2 or 3 Africans in the room. It didn't dawn on me at that time, but at the end of his speech, when we reflected on the speech, he spent about 45 to 50 minutes talking about the African experience and MLK and all that stuff. So one of the person in the club asked him, well, why didn't you speak about Indians? Because it's an Indian club, you have an Indian audience, He didn't have an answer, which really was surprising to me. He says, well, this is part of our history. So my point in saying this is that Kimani and Alexander also, I do wish, and I think I had expressed this before, we have Ravi Dev in Guyana, Ravi Dev and Ravi Dev. We don't have enough people like Kimani and Alexander who can articulate so well the African position. And the reason I say that is because from looking at our history, we don't have the caliber of people, and this is a sad state of affairs in terms of where we are, because we're talking about education. And if we're going to revamp the education curriculum in Guyana so we can understand and appreciate everybody's history, you want to be able to have those people who are well endowed in the knowledge of that education. So I mean, we're having a discussion here and we don't even have the Amerindian perspective, right? So we're dealing with 2 sides in a society that is very plural. So I wish we had more discussion on this, because one of the things that I've seen in a lot of these books written by especially Indians is that, the migration from India to the diasporic communities were pretty much voluntary, right? Which is, you can make an argument, yes, that's true. It's very different from the African experience. But the point is, we don't see a distinction between the history of Indians when you compare, Indian history to the experience of others. Yes, we are brown people. We can be united on certain issues and so on. So this brings me to a couple of quick points I do want to make, and which is something that troubles me. We cannot make the argument when we talk about the current state. The current state of Guyana is not the same state as the state that exists prior to 1966. By the same token, we can't make an argument, it's going to be a difficult argument to make, that the revolutionary government of Cuba under Castro is the same state as the Batista state. By the same token, we can't say that the revolutionaries who fought to create a new state in the United States are the same, it represents the same state prior to that. You can argue for reparations in the United States because it's the same state that exists after independence, right? Which enforced and established slavery in the United States. But when it comes to Guyana, my problem here is that if you're saying it is the same state, and this is the point I had made about something that David Hines has said, you're double dipping because you're making an argument on the one hand that those who practice slavery, right, the plantocracy, the absentee owners and so on, have to provide reparations. We've seen that with the fifth generation Gladstone family who came to Guyana. But if you're saying, okay, that's fine, which all of us agree, and nobody disagrees with that, right? We all support reparations. But now you're saying that the current state of Guyana has to pay Africans reparation because their blood and their bones and flesh are buried, in those dungeons where those oil are being kept. Then you're now saying, well, it's the Amerindians, it's the Indians, and it's the other people in Guyana who are now being asked to pay reparations. So you're double dipping. And I stand by that argument that I made. It is not the same state. And it's difficult to make that argument. The other thing I do want to make is I have read someplace a while back that the Native Americans who crossed the Bering Strait may have lived in Asia. So that probably means that they do have some DNA that is connected to my ancestral people in India. If that's the case, maybe the three Amerindian tribes that Vincent talked about that may have come before Africa, maybe the other five have the DNA of my ancestors from India. So therefore, I can now make the argument that my ancestors were here long before many of the Amerindians, way before the Africans who came, right? So we came before Columbus, if you want to make that argument. My point in saying that is this, and it comes back to the question, and I want to be very blunt about this because we can't speak in a vacuum. Where does this end, right? The whole question of entitlement. Kimani talked about his personal experience. Well, my father was a very religious person. He would do his Lakshmi puja. Lakshmi is the goddess of wealth. He built a cottage. We lived there. He had 9 kids. Then he built a house, had 1 room, expanded that house. He bought some land, and that he was doing that while he worked at the estate, and he got hit by a punt that broke his hip, but he still continued. So my point is, we never complained. I've never heard him or anyone else complain about the fact that, well, it's the colonials, it's the British, who caused this high rate of suicide or alcoholism among Indians. They bear their shame, as we would say, and they continued. So my problem with this whole argument is that it comes back to this question again of entitlement, because I've heard it before, and what I have heard before is that, repeat what I said before, we came here before, we suffered more, we uplift Guyana 5,000 miles above the seacoast. Africans lifted, 100 million tons of dirt. That's in the, the report that Nigel Hughes quoted. brilliant lawyer. I wouldn't have him as a math teacher, but he's a brilliant lawyer. I don't know how they came up with that figure. But again, I'm not trying to make a mockery of this issue, right? I'm not trying to be flippant. But there are others in Guyana who have progressed. They have worked their butt off. And I talked about before the show about a person named Harry Prashad, who had so many obstacles in his way. He started out as a woodcutter. He used to sell in the market. He buy a ship, bought a second one. He began to transport wood. And then he eventually said, okay, the heck with this. I'm going to live in India. He took his 6 kids and his wife. He went to India. He lived there for a while, but then he came back. And then he built this town called Prashad Nagar with his own strength. To me, that is the strength of entrepreneurship. Nobody gave him a handout, right? There was no affirmative action to help him. He did this all on his own, and there are many Indians like that in Guyana. Now, we can make the argument that, well, you know, Barnum did a lot of things. You know, he crushed people. On the one hand, he allowed them to have the co-op, right? But on the other hand, he established an authoritarian system that took the power away from local people. So the question is, where do we go from there? And if we're using history as hindsight, we can't simply say that because of history. I mean, the Jews are saying that today, but you know, they were the promised people. They built the temple, right? The Babylonians destroyed it. They built it again. Then the Romans came and destroyed it. Then they went all over Europe, and Hitler did his thing. And then they came back and said, look, this is, you know, the Old Testament says, this is our land. We belong here, right? They can make that claim because they can defend it, right? They have the guns and whatever. So long story short, my point is this. I think we are trying to intellectualize this too much, especially when you have people like Eric Phillips talking about a certain percentage of land. You know, in a country that is so big, you have less than 1 million people, and we have an oil wealth on top of our heads, and we are still, you know, digging ourselves into battle, and we're arguing about land. So it's an important issue when it comes to learning about history, but when we use that historical knowledge or that history and try to make a claim on the state, a different state, mind you, that you owe me this. And at the same time, if that state is going to act on that demand, it means that you are now putting other people at a disadvantage who have sacrificed themselves over generations to be where they are today. And the question is, you know, that one of the things that people are asking today in the United States, for instance, which we support, things like affirmative action and so on. If you don't have a lot of business people, okay, let's create programs to do that. But where and when does it end? And so far, I've asked these questions many times before, and nobody seems to have an answer for me, right? You had 28 years of a government that established itself through institutions, through policies and so on. But yet we seem to forget that, and we now want to start from scratch and go back to the history book, right? So I guess my point and my frustration with this, as you can tell, is that we seem to be using that piece of history, right, to put ourselves on the pedestal. Because I started out by saying we don't have a lot of Indians who could make these kinds of arguments, right? And maybe if we did, we can get to that point where we can say, look, there is that history, but there is something else about history which we can take and say, look, let's come up with a plan, right? A plan which can make things work. And that means we have to discuss a model that can work, an economic model, a political model, you know, that could provide land to everyone and make the system work for everyone. I don't think it's going to be an easy task, but I think that is probably where the focus should be.
Vincent? I think you're muted, Vincent. You're muted. You're muted.
You're still muted, Vincent. That's it. You're good. You're good now. You're good to go.
I'm still muted.
No, man. Yeah, I can hear you
now.
I
You
can
hear
hear you.
me? But it's
Yeah,
muted
yeah.
here. Anyway, I want to start this contribution following on from what Bethlehem has said, because I think it's a critical issue and may well be the stumbling block to where we want to go. I don't accept his argument of the sameness of state. Well, I don't accept
No,
his
I'm saying
argument
that I'm saying the
it's not
state.
the sameness, and it's not the sameness.
I'm saying the state is different. It's not the same state.
Because what is the state? The state really is the interrelationship among people in a particular geographic space, much of which interrelationship is realized through the institutions and the legal frameworks that are at play. And therefore, the state definitionally is what the state is. And in circumstances where those relationships have not changed, where those institutions have remained the same, and where the legal framework has remained the same, it's the extent to which what the state is today is a reflection and a carryover of what the state was yesterday. And it is only through transformation that we can talk about, quote unquote, a different state, though definitionally the state is the state. And so the extent to which, for example, we have a state that does not teach Guyanese history, and therefore at that relational level of recognition of understanding of each other, much has not changed, is the extent to which that state as quote unquote a successor state has to bear the responsibility of the previous state, if we can use terms like successor and previous, because the state is the state. So that in Cuba, for example, the state is the state. It is a relationship among the people, realized largely through institutions. But in Cuba, the way in which the state operates has changed. And so that current state has taken the responsibility we are talking about and has brought about the transformation. And the argument is, forget whether it's 28 years of the PNC or 23 years of the PPP, that our state has not necessarily gone through that kind of transformation and has continued to perpetuate the ills that we are referring to. And therefore, when we talk about double dipping, we are talking about reparations from the standpoint of what happened before emancipation. And I call that in the last occasion external reparations. Those who are here, they've left, or they created certain damage before, and they are in debt, they're indebted. But the extent to which relationships continue to inflict on people, and the extent to which relationships continue to make people disadvantaged, is the extent to which there is still need outside of the external reparations for equitable policies and equitable programs to bring about what I may refer to as equalization. I would concede that this is not simply pitting one group of people against the other group of people, because there are arguments where other groups also require some kind of equitable action because we weren't necessarily affected in the same way. But the extent to which we were affected is the extent to which that requires equitable action for the purposes of equalization. And here's where you have this big problem in Guyana, where the government contends, and they write the United Nations to say, well, there's no problem, we have done A, B, C, and everybody has the same access. But you can't have the same access if, as Kimani earlier said, we're not starting from the same position. The child who goes to the blackboard and is short is not in the same position as the child who goes to the blackboard and is tall. And therefore, the state, the deliverer of education, has to put in place a mechanism so that the short child can equally get to the top of the blackboard as the tall child. And it's in that context we're talking about the responsibility of the state, because it's a successor state, and if it is not in gender transformation, then it's operating on premises that are a source of the problem and has a responsibility to correct that in the quest for equalization and for the quest of emancipation and freedom and all the terms that one may wish to apply. So that, for example, if we talk about the question of lands, and I stated two categories. I didn't bulk everything on the ancestral lands. I stated two categories, and I did that for purpose because of my own disposition to the question of ancestral lands. And I did say ancestral lands, quote unquote, because I know what's the universal definition of ancestral lands and the applicability of that definition. But locally, we understand what we mean by ancestral lands. I understand what I mean by it. Not in relation to all of the lands in Guyana, but in relation to those which were bequeathed, having been purchased by our ancestors. If we look at those lands, and we see the legal regime which has been developed in relation to those lands, we see a situation where quote-unquote ancestral lands now fall under the aegis of local democratic organs. It doesn't matter to me which government is in place, because the government is only one element of the state, but it's a driving element. Those lands fall under the aegis of local authority. And so, for example, if you go to Fowles Buxton, you now have a situation where in Fowles Buxton, the state, an organ of the state, has a responsibility for how those lands are treated. With a flawed system which, in treating with those lands, does not give recognition to the fact that those lands were purchased by the people of African descent. And through institutional and legal arrangements, fell under the state, which now can appropriate those lands away from the people of African descent. And it's in that context, for example, that I call for a resuscitation of village councils, so that at least on the question of lands, you can have the village, which to some extent is homogeneous, responsible for lands which it would have inherited from the ancestors, and not have a council that is unrelated to those lands, making a determination of what will happen with those lands, and by virtue of that, dispossessing today people of African descent of lands which were purchased. Now, our state has done some institutional changes and, and our legal framework on lands. And what have they done? They have abolished the institution that allowed for people to occupy and subsequently own Crown lands or state lands. They've abolished that. So they're protecting a particular interest, but they have retained the institution that allows people to occupy and over years acquire lands that belong to others. So the state has now protected itself from that kind of acquisition, but at the institutional and legal level, it has retained the old instruments that have facilitated dispossession, and in this instance, of lands which belong to the people of African descent. So that let's forget about reparations pre-emancipation and look at what has evolved post-emancipation and the way in which the state has represented interests, have discriminated, and therefore raised the question that we are raising in the decade of justice. The system has continued to be unjust and has imposed injustice on people, and that is the kind of rectification that is being called for. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is I agree, and the argument has been proffered here, education is critical. It's very, very critical. Because what education should seek to do is to create an understanding across the board of the differences and the commonalities of the ethnic groups. And in that context, to create an understanding, what I refer to as mutual respect. Because we hear the argument every day about who has been able to do what and who has not been able to do what. And we pose the question as why who has not been able to do what, has not been able to do what, when others have been able to do it. And it's only through an understanding of the way in which our society has evolved and the differentiation of the evolution of the peoples, not only the material level, but including the material level, but at the psychological level, that can give an explanation that does not seek to say, what is very often said. I do recall Yesu Prasad, when IPED was being established, coming to the university to talk about the establishment of IPED. And here he was essentially in the first instance getting funds from, I think, the Germans to establish IPED. And I said to him, sir, given the history of the people of African descent and their involvement in business, with IPED being formulated, shouldn't IPED seek to have an understanding of why is it that the people of African descent are positioned where they're positioned, and to see how this organization, a part of the state, could seek to address the causal factor in relation to what you're saying about people of African descent and business. And his response was, the man got almost red on me and said that people have to be industrious and to work hard. And in a sense, that's not his problem. But he was receiving these funds, not as a superstar. He's receiving these funds as an institution in Guyana that should be addressing the realities of Guyana, but was not doing so because of a disposition. And so I'm saying, and I repeat, that we have to get to the point where we understand, what informs those prejudices and what informs those stereotypings about each other, to the point where we can become respectful, but also the state should take the responsibility for dealing with the causal factors so that we can all have an opportunity to approach the opportunities that are available from a standpoint of some degree of psychological and material equalness, as opposed to the psychological and material unequalness bearing in mind that I'm not applying this to one ethnic group. I'm saying that different ethnic groups have been affected in different ways, and we have to be addressing this issue as it has arisen. Beto, you often raise the question of the absence of Indo-Guyanese activists, so to speak, to represent the Indian cause. And I've said this before. African Guyanese do not have a single institution for historical reasons to represent them. And so what has occurred in the African Guyanese community is a whole range of institutions, and they're not all necessarily in sync, that seek to represent the African Guyanese. In the absence of a historical institution, unlike the Indo-Guyanese, who have, I would contend, the Hindu body, which is not merely religious body. It's a whole framework of principles, of way of life and all of that. And therefore there is the ongoing inculcation, and I dare say representation of the interests of the people of Indian descent by virtue of the impact of that institution. And you can't equate their state, the state of the people of African descent, who do not have such, quote unquote, a monolithic institution. And so I think that
But just a question, Vincent. I'm just curious about this. You're referring to the Vindhya Prasad's institution and her being a Hindu person in the government.
Not to her as a Hindu person in the government. I'm referring to the Hindu establishment as an institution, as a part of this state we are talking about. And that in the Hindu institution, on one hand, they're able to relate to Hindus in a rather monolithic way. Rather, I know that there are some segregations, in a rather monolithic way, so that there's inheritance and things that's taking place. And they're able to have people of Indian descent contribute and speak to things from that monolithic perspective. And so that there isn't a need for these various groups, as is the case, the African community.
Come on, Vincent. You're
less monolithic. Less monolithic community.
You
have to start winding
I'm
up.
not going to go to the political parties aspect. I'm not going to go there at all.
Okay, but you said a lot there at the end, which I really I think that's going to be a good topic for us. I mean, we're only 20%. There's two of us here, so there's probably like 18% left in Guyana.
Kimani's not here, you know. Kimani's not here.
But that's
we're equal. Myself and Ravi are here, and Ravi got some other roots in other places that I don't have, so I am more here than him. And yourself and Kamani are not here. So that's the other point I wanted to make.
Vincent, we have to start wrapping up.
The question to answer your earlier questions. I have made the point about how lands could be taken away. And to say that from the standpoint of justice, I do not see, if we can argue that lands were taken away, that we can go back and say, give us back those lands. I think that will now be an unjust act against those people who would have acquired those lands. So without prejudicing the argument, I would say that mechanisms, and you've called for it, have got to be put in place where lands may have been unjustly taken away, to have some kind of reparation. That does not necessarily mean dispossessing people who have legally acquired lands, and that with all the land we have, the state may say, well, you have lost this unjustly, and since we have got so much, here is your reparation. And so you do not affect the person who claimedly has dispossessed, but you give some kind of reparative justice to the person who has been dispossessed. So there are mechanisms for dealing with that if it arises at all. And so it is in that context that you may want to say what we are saying as some kind of entitlement. But certainly, in my humble opinion, if one looks at how the society has evolved pre-emancipation and post-emancipation, the case can be made, and that when the UN declared a decade, I think they came to a universal recognition that this, what I am arguing, has in fact occurred across the globe, but we have to localize it. It hasn't occurred exactly in the same way in every place. So Barbados can't be like Guyana. It's different because of,
Vincent, we have to start wrapping up. I'm sorry.
Right? And so in that regard, there is need for reparations internal and reparations external.
All right. We should have been doing a final round, but I don't know if we have enough time. We don't. I really wanted to respond to some things that Betaram said. I find them very painful, and we need to discuss these things. I still think that it's very important for us to say what we think we know, how we feel. In other words, to discuss these questions. So in closing, I'm still saying that we're on the correct road. We may have disagreements, misunderstandings, call it what you will, but I still think that this is a very important activity that we're engaging in, and I'm looking forward for us taking up this discussion. I think Betaram had a suggestion of what we will do in the next one, and I certainly would like to respond to some of the things Betaram said, because I don't think you understand the question of reparations. It's not that we're seeking for handouts. We deserve justice. And that's how I'm going to end it. And you could ask me to explain justice another time, I'll explain it. But I don't want to, run over too much. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. We've been talking about this panel and balance and so on. We haven't had women on the panel, and it might be something for us to think about as we go forward. But thanks once again for your input, and I look forward to the next engagement. Thank you very much.